Jake had always been the kind of guy who liked things quiet and simple. His small apartment near the college campus was his safe space. Everything had its place. Books stacked neatly on his desk, clothes folded in perfect piles, and not a single dish left unwashed in the sink. At 22, he had his routine down to a science. Wake up at 7, grab coffee, attend his psychology classes, work his shift at the campus library, come home, study, sleep, repeat. Most people would call his life boring, but Jake loved it that way. No drama, no surprises, no complications. He was the guy who sat in the back row of every class, never raised his hand unless absolutely necessary, and could go entire days speaking to maybe 3 people total. His professors knew him as the quiet one who always turned in perfect assignments on time. His co-workers at the library appreciated that he never gossiped or caused any trouble. The apartment building he lived in was old but cheap, which was perfect for a college student working part-time. The walls were thin enough that he could hear his neighbors' conversations, TV shows and phone calls whether he wanted to or not. But Jake had learned to tune it all out with his noise-canceling headphones and focus on his studies. His next-door neighbor was a woman named Lisa, who seemed to have her life together way more than most people their age. She worked downtown at some law office, always dressed in professional clothes, and drove a decent car. Jake had maybe spoken to her 5 times in the 8 months he'd been living there. Their conversations never went beyond good morning or have a nice day in the hallway. Lisa appeared to be everything Jake wasn't, confident, outgoing, and successful. He'd see her coming and going at all hours, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone, but always looking like she belonged in some fancy office building rather than their rundown apartment complex. She was the type of person who seemed to have everything figured out, while Jake was still trying to decide what he wanted to do after graduation. The building housed mostly college students and young professionals who couldn't afford anything better. Everyone pretty much kept to themselves, which suited Jake perfectly. He didn't want to deal with loud parties, relationship drama, or any of the chaos that seemed to follow people his age everywhere they went. On this particular Tuesday evening in late November, Jake was deep into preparing for his final exams. His psychology textbooks were spread across his small desk, highlighters and sticky notes scattered everywhere. He had 3 major tests coming up in the next 2 weeks, and his usual perfectionist tendencies were in overdrive. The library job helped pay for school, but it also meant he had less time to study than most students. The apartment was completely silent, except for the soft hum of his ancient heater, trying to keep the cold autumn air at bay. Jake liked studying in complete silence. No music, no background noise, just him and his books. He was reviewing a particularly difficult chapter on behavioral psychology when he first heard the shouting. At first, he tried to ignore it. Living in a building full of young people meant dealing with the occasional argument or loud phone call. But this was different. The voice coming through the wall was Lisa's, and she sounded angrier than he'd ever heard anyone sound. Her voice was high-pitched and strained, like she was trying not to cry while also trying to sound tough. Jake couldn't make out the exact words, but the tone was unmistakable. She was arguing with someone, and it was getting heated fast. He tried to focus on his textbook, but the shouting kept getting louder. Then he heard what sounded like something heavy hitting the wall, followed by the distinct sound of glass breaking. For a moment, everything went completely quiet. The sudden silence was almost worse than the shouting had been. Jake found himself holding his breath, listening for any sign of what was happening next door. His psychology training had taught him about domestic situations, and something about this felt wrong. He told himself it wasn't his business. Lisa was clearly capable of handling her own problems. She was older, more experienced, and definitely tougher than his quiet, bookish lifestyle had made him. But the silence stretched on, and Jake found it impossible to concentrate on his studying. 20 minutes passed with nothing but silence from next door. Jake had almost convinced himself to get back to his books when he heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, quick footsteps that stopped right outside his door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and it was almost 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Then his door burst open. Jake's first thought was that someone had broken into the wrong apartment. His second thought was complete confusion as he recognized Lisa, standing in his doorway, but not the Lisa he knew from their polite hallway encounters. This version of Lisa looked like she'd been through a war. Her usually perfect hair was a mess, hanging loose around her shoulders instead of in its normal, neat style. Her professional blazer was torn at the shoulder, and her white shirt had what looked like coffee stains down the front. But most shocking of all was her face. Her makeup was smeared, her eyes were red, and she looked absolutely desperate. Jake sat frozen at his desk, a highlighter still in his hand, trying to process what he was seeing. How had she gotten into his apartment? Why was she here? And why did she look like someone had put her through a blender? Lisa stepped into his room without invitation, her hands shaking as she closed the door behind her. When she looked at him, Jake could see something in her eyes that he'd never seen before. Pure, undiluted fear mixed with a determination that seemed almost dangerous. "I need your help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow commanding his complete attention. "And I need you to do exactly what I tell you to do." Jake stared at Lisa, his mind racing to understand what was happening. This wasn't the composed professional woman he knew from the hallway. This person standing in his room looked like she'd been running for her life. Her breathing was heavy, and she kept glancing toward the window like she expected someone to appear there at any moment. "Lisa, what's going on?" Jake finally managed to ask, setting down his highlighter with shaking hands. "How did you get in here?" She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a key. "Emergency key from the landlord's office," she said quickly. "I'm sorry for breaking in, but I didn't have time to knock and wait. I need you to listen to me very carefully." Jake watched as she moved to his window and peeked through the blinds down at the parking lot below. The way she was acting reminded him of those thriller movies where someone was being chased by dangerous people. But this wasn't a movie. This was real life, and it was happening in his quiet, boring apartment. "You have to help me," Lisa continued, turning back to face him. Her voice was urgent, but she was trying to stay calm. "I know we don't really know each other, but you're the only person I can trust right now." "Trust with what?" Jake asked, standing up from his desk chair. His psychology textbook suddenly seemed completely unimportant compared to whatever crisis had brought Lisa to his door. Lisa took a deep breath and started explaining. "You know I work at Morrison & Associates downtown, right? The law firm." Jake nodded. He'd heard her mention it once or twice in their brief conversations. "Well, I found something I wasn't supposed to find. Documents that show my boss has been moving money illegally for some very dangerous people." Jake felt his stomach drop. This was way beyond anything he'd ever dealt with in his quiet college life. "What kind of documents?" "Financial records, emails, bank transfers, everything that proves he's been helping criminals hide their money through fake legal cases." Lisa's hands were still shaking as she talked. "I made copies of everything on this flash drive before anyone realized what I'd discovered." She pulled a small USB drive from her pocket and held it up like it was made of gold. "This has enough evidence to send him and his clients to prison for a very long time. But he found out that I know." "The argument I heard through the wall?" Jake asked. "That was him on the phone telling me that I needed to forget what I saw and destroy any copies I made. When I refused, he said he was sending people to make sure I stayed quiet permanently." Lisa's voice cracked a little when she said the word permanently. Jake sat back down in his chair trying to process everything she was telling him. "So you came here because I need somewhere safe to stay tonight, and I need someone to help me get this evidence to the right people tomorrow." Lisa looked at him with desperate eyes. "I chose you because you're quiet, you keep to yourself, and nobody would think to look for me here." It wasn't exactly flattering to hear that he'd been chosen for help because he was forgettable. But Jake understood her logic. He was probably the most invisible person in the building. "What exactly do you need me to do?" Lisa sat down on the edge of his bed, finally looking a little less panicked now that she was explaining her situation. "First, I need you to hide this flash drive somewhere safe, somewhere nobody would think to look if they searched your apartment." Jake looked around his neat, organized room. "Where would be safe enough?" "You're a college student. You must have textbooks everywhere, right?" Lisa gestured toward his desk. "Can you hide it inside one of your books? Tape it to a page in the middle where nobody would find it unless they were specifically looking. That actually made sense. Jake had dozens of textbooks, and most of them were thick enough to hide a small flash drive without anyone noticing. Okay, I can do that. What else? Tomorrow morning we need to get to the FBI field office about 2 hours from here. I have a contact there, an agent I worked with on a case last year who I know I can trust. Lisa stood up and started pacing around his small room. But I can't use my car, he probably has people watching it. And I can't take public transportation because it's too easy to track. You want me to drive you? Jake asked, already knowing the answer but hoping he was wrong. It's the only way. Your car, your normal routine, we can make it look like you're just going out for the day. Nobody knows we're connected, so they won't be watching you. Jake thought about his old Honda sitting in the parking lot. It wasn't much to look at, but it was reliable enough to make a 2-hour drive. The bigger question was whether he was brave enough to get involved in something this serious. Lisa, I'm not exactly the action hero type, he said honestly. I spend my days studying and shelving books. I've never done anything more dangerous than jaywalking. She stopped pacing and looked at him seriously. Jake, I'm not asking you to fight anyone or do anything crazy. I just need you to drive me to the FBI office and back up my story. That's it. But if I try to do this alone, I might not make it. They're alive. The weight of what she was saying hit Jake like a truck. This wasn't just some adventure. Lisa genuinely believed her life was in danger, and she'd chosen him as her only hope for getting help. How do you know you can trust me? Jake asked. We barely know each other. Lisa smiled for the first time since she'd burst through his door. Because in 8 months of living next door to you, I've never heard you raise your voice, never seen you bring drama into the building, and never caught you in a lie about anything. You're exactly the kind of person who does the right thing when it matters. Jake wasn't sure if that was true, but he could hear the sincerity in her voice. She really believed he was someone she could count on. The question was whether he could live up to that belief. Jake stared at the flash drive in Lisa's hand for what felt like forever. Everything in his brain was telling him this was way too big for him to handle. He was just a college student who liked quiet nights and predictable routines. Getting involved in some criminal conspiracy was definitely not part of his life plan. But looking at Lisa, really looking at her, he could see how scared she was underneath all that determination. Her hands were still shaking, and she kept glancing toward the window like she expected someone to break down the door at any moment. This wasn't some made-up drama. She was genuinely terrified. Okay, Jake said quietly. I'll help you. The relief on Lisa's face was immediate and overwhelming. For a second, he thought she might actually cry. Thank you, she whispered. I know this is asking a lot from someone you barely know. Jake stood up and took the flash drive from her hand. It was so small and light, but knowing what was on, it made it feel like it weighed 100 pounds. Where's the safest place to hide this? They spent the next few minutes going through his textbooks, looking for the best hiding spot. Finally, they settled on his abnormal psychology textbook, a thick, boring book that nobody would ever want to look through. Jake carefully taped the drive to a page right in the middle, then closed the book and put it back in its normal spot on his shelf. Now what? Jake asked. Now we need to plan how to get out of here tomorrow without anyone noticing, Lisa said. She'd moved back to the window and was peeking through the blinds again. We should leave early before most people are awake. Take back roads instead of the highway. Make it look like a normal day trip. Jake joined her at the window and looked down at the parking lot. Everything looked normal, a few cars parked in their usual spots, the old streetlight casting its yellow glow over the cracked pavement. But now that he knew people might be watching Lisa, every shadow looked suspicious. How will we know if someone's following us? Jake asked. I've been thinking about that, Lisa replied. We'll need to take a route that lets us check behind us. Maybe stop at a coffee shop or gas station and see if the same car stops too. This was starting to feel more real by the minute. Jake had gone from studying for psychology exams to planning what sounded like an escape route in the span of an hour. What if they catch us? Lisa was quiet for a moment. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But Jake, if something goes wrong and we get separated, you need to promise me something. What? Promise me you'll still get that flash drive to the FBI, even if I can't make it with you. Her voice was deadly serious. There's enough evidence on there to put some very bad people away for a long time. That's more important than what happens to me. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The way she said, "if I can't make it," made this whole situation feel even more dangerous than he'd realized. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I hope you're right," Lisa replied, "but I needed to say it just in case." They spent the next hour going over every detail of their plan. They would leave at 6 in the morning, when most people were still asleep. Jake would drive his normal route to get coffee, then gradually work their way toward the highway using back roads. Lisa would stay low in the passenger seat until they were out of town. As they talked, Jake found himself noticing things about Lisa that he'd never seen before. Despite being scared, she was incredibly smart and thorough. She thought through every possible problem and had backup plans for everything. This wasn't someone who panicked easily, which made her current fear even more concerning. "Why did you get involved in this in the first place?" Jake asked. "Why didn't you just pretend you never saw those documents?" Lisa sighed and sat down on his bed again. "Because people are getting hurt. The money my boss is hiding isn't just tax evasion or some white-collar crime. It's money from drug dealers, human traffickers, and worse. Every dollar he helps them hide means more people suffer." Jake had never thought about crime in those terms before. In his textbooks, it was all theoretical, case studies and statistics. But Lisa was talking about real people being hurt by the criminals her boss was protecting. "I couldn't just pretend I didn't know," she continued. "My conscience wouldn't let me. So I started making copies of everything, thinking I could turn it over to the police. But then I realized some of the police might be involved too." "That's why you need to go to the FBI?" "Exactly. They're the only ones I know for sure aren't connected to this local network." Lisa looked at Jake with something that might have been admiration. "You know, most people would have told me to leave and pretended this conversation never happened." Jake shrugged. "Maybe I'm not as smart as most people." "Or maybe you're smarter than you think," Lisa replied. "It takes real courage to help someone when you don't have to." Jake didn't feel particularly courageous. Mostly he felt scared and way out of his depth. But something about Lisa's situation had triggered something in him that he didn't even know existed. Maybe it was all those psychology classes about moral development, or maybe it was just knowing that someone needed his help and he was the only one who could provide it. Either way, there was no backing out now. Tomorrow morning, his quiet, predictable life was going to become something completely different. And despite being terrified, part of him was almost excited to find out what he was really capable of when it mattered. Jake barely slept that night. Every time he started to drift off, he'd hear a car door slam or footsteps in the hallway, and his heart would start racing again. Lisa had decided to stay in his apartment for safety, sleeping on his small couch, with one of his textbooks as a pillow. Even in the dim light from his desk lamp, he could see she wasn't sleeping much either. At 5:30 in the morning, they both gave up on trying to rest. Jake made coffee with shaking hands while Lisa checked the window for the 100th time. The parking lot looked exactly the same as always, but somehow everything felt different now that he knew they might be being watched. "You ready for this?" Lisa asked as they prepared to leave. She'd borrowed one of Jake's hooded sweatshirts and had her hair pulled back under a baseball cap she'd found in his closet. It was a pretty good disguise. She looked more like a college student than a paralegal. Jake grabbed his car keys and took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." They made their way down to the parking lot, trying to look casual. Jake's Honda was parked in its usual spot near the back, away from the streetlights. As they walked toward it, Jake noticed a dark sedan parked across the street that he'd never seen before. Two people were sitting inside, and even from a distance, he could tell they were watching the building. "Don't look at them," Lisa whispered, pulling her hood up higher. "Just act normal." Getting into the car felt like the longest 30 seconds of Jake's life. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get them into the ignition. Finally, the engine started and they slowly pulled out of the parking lot. Jake drove his normal route to the coffee shop he visited every morning, checking his rearview mirror constantly. The dark sedan was following them, staying about 3 cars back but definitely keeping pace. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure Lisa could hear it. "They're behind us, aren't they?" Lisa asked without turning around. "Yeah," Jake replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" "Stick to the plan. Act like we're just getting coffee and running errands. They don't know where we're actually going yet." At the coffee shop, Jake parked and went inside alone while Lisa stayed low in the passenger seat. Through the window, he could see the dark sedan had parked at the gas station across the street. He ordered his usual coffee and a muffin, trying to act like everything was normal even though his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his wallet. Back in the car, they started the real journey. Jake took back roads he remembered from his high school job delivering pizza, winding through residential neighborhoods and industrial areas that most people never saw. For a while, it seemed like they'd lost their followers. But 20 minutes later, Lisa spotted them again in the side mirror. "They found us," she said quietly. "These people are better than I thought." Jake's old Honda wasn't built for high-speed chases, but he did his best to stay ahead. He took turns he remembered from his childhood, cut through parking lots, and even drove the wrong way down a one-way street for half a block. His quiet, predictable life had definitely not prepared him for this kind of stress. "There," Lisa pointed to an exit sign ahead. "Take that exit and pull into the truck stop. We need to change our approach." The truck stop was busy with early morning travelers and long-haul drivers. Jake parked between 2 big trucks where their small car would be hard to spot. They sat there for 10 minutes, watching the entrance, but the dark sedan never appeared. "Think we lost them," Jake said, finally allowing himself to breathe normally. "For now," Lisa replied, "but they'll be looking for us on all the main routes. We need a different plan." That's when Lisa had an idea that seemed crazy, but might actually work. She approached one of the truck drivers who was filling up his rig, a friendly-looking older man with a baseball cap and a thermos of coffee. After a brief conversation, she came back to Jake with a smile. "His name is Roy, and he's heading in the same direction we need to go," Lisa explained. "He's agreed to let us ride with him for a few hours if we help pay for gas." Jake looked at the massive 18-wheeler and felt his stomach flip. "You want us to abandon my car and hitchhike with a stranger?" "It's perfect," Lisa insisted. "They're looking for your Honda, not a truck. And Roy seems like a good guy. He's got pictures of his grandkids on his dashboard and everything." It wasn't exactly what Jake had planned for his first adventure outside, his comfort zone. But nothing about this situation was going according to plan. They grabbed their essential items from the car, leaving it parked at the truck stop, and climbed up into Roy's cab. Roy turned out to be exactly what they needed, a chatty grandfather who was happy for the company and didn't ask too many questions about why 2 college-age kids needed a ride to the city. He told stories about his years on the road while classic country music played softly on the radio. For the first time since this whole thing started, Jake felt like they might actually make it. The truck was high enough that he could see for miles in every direction, and there was no sign of the dark sedan or anyone else following them. Lisa even managed to relax enough to doze off against the window. 2 hours later, Roy dropped them off at a rest stop about 20 minutes from the FBI field office. They thanked him profusely and watched his truck disappear down the highway, before calling a taxi to take them the rest of the way. As they rode toward what they hoped would be safety, Jake realized something had changed in him over the past 18 hours. The scared college student who just wanted to study in peace was still there, but he'd found something else inside himself too, a strength he never knew existed. The FBI field office was nothing like what Jake had expected from movies and TV shows. It was just a regular-looking office building with extra security and a lot of people in suits walking around looking serious. Lisa seemed nervous as they approached the front desk, but she managed to keep her voice steady as she asked for Agent Rodriguez. "We don't have an appointment," Lisa explained to the receptionist, "but this is about a case Agent Rodriguez worked on last year involving Morrison and Associates. It's urgent." The receptionist made a phone call, and 15 minutes later, a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and sharp eyes came out to meet them. Agent Rodriguez looked exactly like what Jake imagined an FBI agent should look like. Professional, alert, and just a little intimidating. "Lisa," Agent Rodriguez said, recognizing her immediately. "What are you doing here? And who's your friend?" Lisa quickly introduced Jake and gave a brief explanation of why they were there. Agent Rodriguez's expression grew more serious with each detail, and by the time Lisa mentioned the flash drive, she was already leading them toward a secure conference room. "You were smart to come here," Agent Rodriguez said as they sat down around a polished table. "We've been investigating Morrison and Associates for months, but we haven't been able to get solid evidence of their money laundering operation." Jake pulled out his abnormal psychology textbook and carefully removed the flash drive from where they'd hidden it. Handing it over to Agent Rodriguez felt like passing off a bomb. He was relieved to get rid of it, but worried about what would happen. Next, Agent Rodriguez plugged the drive into her laptop and spent the next hour going through the files, while Lisa explained how she'd discovered them and what each document meant. Jake mostly sat quietly, still not quite believing he was actually sitting in an FBI office helping with a real criminal investigation. "This is incredible," Agent Rodriguez finally said. "You've given us everything we need to build a solid case. Bank records, email communications, client lists. This is exactly what we've been looking for." "So what happens now?" Lisa asked. "Now we move fast," Agent Rodriguez replied. "Based on what you've told us about threats made against you, we need to get arrest warrants issued immediately. We'll coordinate with other field offices to make sure we get everyone at the same time." The next few hours felt like a blur. Jake and Lisa were interviewed separately, giving detailed statements about everything that had happened. Jake had to explain multiple times how he'd gotten involved, and each time he told the story, it sounded more unbelievable to him. By late afternoon, Agent Rodriguez came back with updates. "We've arrested Morrison and 6 other people connected to the operation. The local police officers who were involved have been taken into custody by Internal Affairs, and the people who were following you have been picked up as well." Jake felt a huge weight lift off his shoulders. "So it's over?" "The immediate danger is over," Agent Rodriguez confirmed. "But we'll need both of you to testify when this goes to trial. Lisa, you'll be our star witness, and Jake, your testimony about the threats and the chase will help establish the intimidation charges." Over the next few months, Jake's life changed in ways he never could have imagined. The trial made local news, and suddenly everyone at college knew him as the guy who helped bring down a criminal conspiracy. His professors were impressed. His classmates wanted to hear the story over and over, and he even got interviewed by the campus newspaper. But the biggest change was in Jake himself. The shy, invisible student who had been afraid of any kind of confrontation discovered he was capable of real courage when it mattered. He changed his major from general psychology to criminal justice, inspired by his experience with Agent Rodriguez and the FBI. Lisa had to relocate to a different city for her safety during the trial preparation, but she kept in touch with Jake through emails and phone calls. In one message, she wrote, "I knew I was right to trust you. You turned out to be exactly the kind of person who does the right thing when someone needs help." A year later, when the trial was finally over and all the criminals had been sentenced, Jake received a letter from Agent Rodriguez. She offered him an internship with the FBI for the following summer, saying his experience and dedication had impressed everyone who worked on the case. Jake accepted the internship, and it led to a career he never would have imagined for himself. He became a victim advocate, helping other people who found themselves in dangerous situations similar to what Lisa had faced. His quiet, analytical nature turned out to be perfect for the detailed investigative work, and his experience as someone who had overcome his fears to help others made him especially good at earning victims' trust. Looking back, Jake realized that the night Lisa burst into his room had been the most important moment of his life. It had forced him to discover who he really was underneath all his fears and insecurities. He learned that being brave wasn't about not being scared. It was about doing the right thing even when you were terrified. Sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when the situation calls for it. Jake had been just a quiet college student who liked predictable routines. But when someone needed his help, he found the courage to step up and make a difference. And that made all the difference in the world.